Welcome. Today in this lecture, we are going to discuss what is life and what are the characteristic features of life. We would have a detailed look on if those characteristic features are able to qualify to be the defining features of life. So here we have the definition of life. Life is a self-sustaining, self-replicating, evolving, interactive system of biomolecules that is capable of responding to a stimulus. So now here we can see that to qualify to be living, we need to be self-sustaining. That is, that system should be able to take care of its food and energy requirement. It needs to be self-replicating. That means the system should be able to create its multiple copies. The system must be able to reproduce. It should be evolving. That is, it should be able to adapt to the environment, and if need be, it should be able to change along with the changing environment. It should be an interactive system. That is, it should be able to interact with the surrounding environment, and it should be able to respond to a stimulus, that is a change in the external environment. So before we try to understand what is life, we need to know what are biomolecules. I call them the building blocks of living systems. So biomolecules are hydrocarbon derivatives which are sourced from biosphere. That is, these are the organic substances found in a living system or in an organism. Basically, biomolecules necessarily will contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, in addition to these three elements, there may be sulfur, phosphorus, nitrogen, etc. A few examples of biomolecules are carbohydrates, that is sugars, which will contain glucose, fructose, cellulose, chitin, mucilages, etc. We have the fats, then we have the proteins, and we have the nucleic acids, that is DNA and the RNA, as the examples of biomolecules. Here you can take a look at one of the biomolecules, that is glucose, which is the main energy source of our body. So you can see it contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in it. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen would necessarily be present in biomolecules. So it's clear from the definition that the living organisms will have a level of organization, will show growth, will be able to reproduce, will show metabolism, and will have consciousness. These five are the characteristic features of living, or the characteristic features of life. Now, what is living and what is non-living? Something that currently has life is living. Something that currently does not have life is non-living. But non-living further can be of two types: inanimate and dead. Something that had life in the past but currently does not have life is dead, and something that never had life in the past or in the present is called inanimate. Now let's have a detailed discussion on these five characteristic features of life. The first characteristic feature of life is organization or order. Here we have a hierarchy of levels of organization. First of all is the atomic level of organization, in which atoms act as the building blocks. Then we come on to the molecular level of organization, in which the molecules act as the building blocks. Both atomic and molecular level of organizations do not qualify to be the defining features of life. In atomic level of organization, we have diamond and metallic lattices as an example. In molecular level of organization, we have cellulose, proteins, ice and dry ice as an example. In the diagram, it's clearly seen that ice contains water molecules as the lattice points or the building blocks, and in case of cellulose, the glucose molecule acts as the monomer or the building block. Further in the hierarchy is the cellular level of organization. I have marked it with a green checkbox that shows it's a defining feature of life. Cellular level of organization is found in bacteria, protists, and fungi. Now you need to understand, cells are the defining features of life. Cells act as a miniaturized and closed laboratory in which all the metabolic reactions can occur. So anything containing cells will qualify to be living. Higher in the hierarchy, we have tissue, organ, or organ system level of organization, which is found in plants and animals. However, these levels of organization are higher to the cellular level of organization, but for sure we know that all tissues, organs, and organ systems are going to contain cells. So anything made up of cells is living. For example, in the diagram, as we can see, we have the four animal tissues: the connective tissue, the epithelial tissue, muscular tissue, and the nervous tissue. These are all composed of cells. Basically, a tissue is a group of cells having a common origin, so they also qualify to be living systems. Next characteristic feature of life is metabolism. Metabolism is also a defining feature of life because it contains no exception. Any living system will necessarily show metabolism. Now, what is metabolism? Basically, metabolism is the sum total of all the reactions occurring inside a system. Metabolism can further be of two types: anabolism and catabolism. Anabolic reactions are the build-up reactions, the reactions in which the smaller molecules will react to form the bigger molecules, while catabolic reactions are the reactions in which the larger molecules are broken down into the smaller molecules. For anabolic reactions, we have the synthesis of proteins as an example, in which the amino acids, which are the monomers of the proteins, will result in the formation of large molecules because of polymerization. Similarly, for catabolism, we have digestive reactions as an example, in which large polymers are broken down into their monomers by digestive enzymes. However, there are certain processes in which both catabolic and anabolic reactions can be seen. Such cascades of reactions are termed as amphibolic. So as I told, metabolism is sum total of all the reactions. But if these reactions are being carried out in vitro, that is in some petri dish or test tube, these reactions are called living reactions but are lifeless living reactions. Of course, the test tube does not become a cell because it's having metabolic reactions occurring inside it. But if these metabolic reactions are occurring in vivo, that is inside the natural miniaturized laboratories we call cells, then these living reactions are also going to be defined as life-giving living reactions, and therefore in vivo metabolic reactions qualify to be the defining feature of life. Now, why do we need metabolism? We need metabolism for maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis means maintaining a constant internal environment despite the changes in the external environment. The cell, if falls short of certain molecules, will produce new molecules through certain anabolic reactions. And if there is a buildup of certain excess molecules, then the cell is going to break them down through catabolic reactions. So we can finally say that in vivo metabolic reactions are the defining feature of life. Of course, there is no cell that can live without metabolism. Therefore, metabolism is also an exceptionless feature of life, and any exceptionless feature of life would qualify to be the defining feature of life. Another characteristic feature of life is growth. But how do we come to know that growth is occurring? We come to know that growth is occurring by increase in number, increase in mass, and increase in volume of the bodies of the organism. Increase in number and increase in mass are the twin characters of growth. That is, if an organism is growing, it will have its mass increased and will have an increase in number of cells of that organism. Growth can be of two types. It can be either intrinsic or extrinsic. Extrinsic growth is the one which occurs due to deposition of substances on the external surface. For example, the snow on the mountain, the sand dunes and the deltas, and the growth of crystal lattices. These all growths occur due to the deposition of new substances on the surfaces. However, the extrinsic growth is not at all a feature of living organism. The defining feature of living organism is the intrinsic growth, that is the type of growth that occurs from inside of the body due to cell division. Of course, for cell division you need to form new substances, which will be done by high metabolic rates noticed in the cells about to show growth or reproduction. Now, why is growth required? Growth is required for reproduction, for repair, for maintaining shape and size of the organism. Growth and reproduction may be inclusive or exclusive depending upon the organisms. For unicellular organisms, growth and reproduction are synonymous. That is, growth and reproduction are inclusive events. They occur simultaneously. For example, a bacterial colony will increase in size and also will show an increase in number of individuals in the colony. That is, as the bacteria reproduced, the colony size also increased. The colony shows growth. However, for multicellular plants and animals, growth and reproduction are exclusive events. That is, they are two different events. Plants and animals increase in size with an increase in number of cells, but the number of organisms do not increase. It's Therefore, while the plant is growing, you cannot say the plant is also reproducing. While you may say that the plant will reproduce at a different stage of life. Similarly, in animals, while the animals are growing, you cannot say they are reproducing. And when the animals reproduce, that is, they produce more offsprings, you cannot say they are growing in their size. In multicellular plants, the growth is localized, that is, it is limited to the meristematic tissues. However, in animals, the growth is diffuse, that is, it is not limited to a particular tissue. It is found in all cells of the animals. In plants, growth is unlimited, that is, plants show growth throughout their life. However, in animals, the growth is limited, that is, the body of the animal will stop growing after a particular stage. Therefore, growth, which we call the characteristic feature of life, is not a defining feature of life, because there are many things which will show growth but are not living. For example, the mountains, the sand dunes, the deltas, and the lattices. However, intrinsic growth is a characteristic feature of life, because intrinsic growth will be shown only by living organisms without any exception. Alright, so the next characteristic feature of life is reproduction. What is reproduction? Reproduction is the process or the ability of an individual to replicate on its own. That is, it's the process by which the parents give rise to new individuals. Reproduction is absent in non-living things, while it is present in the living. Reproduction is of two types: asexual reproduction, known as apomixis, and sexual reproduction, known as amphimixis. Sexual reproduction is the one which is biparental, that is, two parents are involved, one male and the other female, which are going to produce gametes. These gametes are going to get fused, that is, fertilization will be observed here, and finally we'll have the zygote formation. All these events are going to lead to the genetic variations. Sexual reproduction results in the formation of new individuals, and we use the term offspring for the individuals produced through sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction, or apomixis, on contrary to the sexual reproduction, is uniparental, that is, a single parent gives rise to new individuals. Here, no formation and fusion of gametes occurs, therefore, no variation will be observed, because there is no fertilization, no formation and fusion of gametes, no crossing over, no hybridization, therefore, no variation is going to occur, and the new individuals produced will be the exact copies of their parents. Now, we use a term ramete for the individuals produced via asexual reproduction, and the group of rametes is termed as a clone. Now let's take a look at different means of asexual reproduction. First of all, we have fragmentation, as is observed in spirogyre. In fragmentation, the main parental body breaks down into the fragments, and each fragment gives rise to the new individuals. Then we have spores and cysts as observed in the microorganisms. Then we have fission, that is binary fission, longitudinal fission, transverse fission as observed in the microorganisms. Here we can see budding in Hydra. In Hydra, the parental body gives rise to a small bud as is observed in the diagram, and finally the bud gives rise to a new individual. Vegetative reproduction as observed in different plants is also a type of asexual reproduction. Regeneration. Regeneration is basically the ability of an individual to produce its lost parts. True regeneration is observed in planaria. Now, what is true regeneration? True regeneration means that in as many parts we cut the organism, each part is going to produce the whole new individual. Here we can observe in the diagram, we cut the planarian body into three parts. One containing the head, then the trunk and the tail part. Each of the part is going to form a new planarian body. That is, each part is going to generate a whole new body. This is called true regeneration and is observed in planaria. So, from this comparative study of asexual and sexual reproduction, we come to a conclusion that asexual reproduction, which is a faster method of reproduction, does not involve any variation. Therefore, the clone generation may be a weaker generation and will not contribute to evolution at all. However, the sexual reproduction, which is though a slower process, does show genetic variation in the next generation, and that generation is highly adaptive to the environment. Therefore, sexual reproduction does contribute to evolution. Reproduction is a characteristic feature of life, but it's not the defining feature of life due to some exceptions. For example, the sterile interspecific hybrids like mule. Mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey, and mule is sterile, that is, it cannot reproduce. But do we consider it as a non-living object? No, it is a living thing. Similarly, in case of honeybees, we have three types of bees: the worker bees, which are sterile, the queen, which is fertile, and the drone, which is fertile. The worker bees are as living as the queen and the drone. And we may also consider the sterile or the infertile human couples. They are not objects, they are living beings. Therefore, reproduction, which is a characteristic feature of life, cannot be said to be a defining feature of life due to certain exceptions, and thus we may say a living being need not necessarily reproduce. The most obvious and technically most complex characteristic feature, as well as a defining feature of all living organisms, is their consciousness. What is consciousness? Consciousness is the sense of the surrounding environment. It is the ability of the organism to respond to a stimulus and to interact with its surroundings. To understand consciousness in a good manner, let's take a look at several outcomes of consciousness. The diurnal activities, that is, the day and night cycles, and the sleep cycle of a child is an example of consciousness. A child will fall asleep as soon as it senses dark. Similarly, chemotaxis, that is, the movement towards or away from a certain chemical substance, is also an example of consciousness. For example, the roots of the plant will always move towards the water, which is also termed as hydrotrophism. Then we may talk about phototaxis. The plants will always show phototropic movements. The shoot will always bend towards the light source. Photoperiodism is also a hint of consciousness. The flowering seasons in the plants and the breeding seasons in the animals are all dependent upon the photoperiodic movements. Here we can take a look in the diagram. Certain plants will start flowering when they are exposed to long days. However, certain plants will start flowering when they are exposed to long nights. This is their dependency on the photoperiods. The reflex actions our body shows are also an outcome of consciousness. We will just leave a hot pan. As soon as we sense heat, we just move our hands away from the source of heat. These reflex actions have been inculcated into our genetic constitution to protect our body from certain damages. Similarly, our senses and feelings like pain, anger, etc., are also an outcome of consciousness. But why is consciousness so important? You can imagine we need consciousness for hemostasis, evolution, and adaptation. A cell, if it doesn't know, is surrounded by its predators, cannot escape. A cell, if it doesn't know, is surrounded by food particles, will not engulf it and die of hunger. Therefore, a sense of surrounding environment and the ability to interact and respond to the changes in that environment or surroundings is of utmost importance for our survival. Humans possess self consciousness, that is, we are self aware, which is a higher degree of consciousness observed in human species. But do we call a person in coma, that is, without any consciousness, a brain dead person, can we call that person living? No. Since a brain dead person lacks self consciousness, the brain dead person will neither be living nor dead so far. So, finally, I would like to suggest you all to go through the definition of life once again so that you can understand it quite well again. And here, at last, I have a small question for all of you to think on. Will robots with artificial intelligence be called living someday? They may develop self replication. They do have consciousness due to artificial intelligence. They may also show intrinsic growth one day and may develop nanodigesters to mimic metabolism. So, will we call them living organisms one day? Think about it. Thank you.